The Japanese invasion of the Philippines was conducted on schedule. The first landing was made on December 8th, and during the 2 weeks following, beachheads were successfully secured at 6 points in the archipelago. The Nipponese assault troops had been well prepared for this kind of campaign. On Luzon, the principal island, the strategy called for the forces which had landed at several points to drive toward Manila and seize that objective. The main strength in that push was provided by the assault group which invaded the island at Lingayen Gulf, 110 miles from Manila, across central Luzon. By Christmas, Japanese invasions had been made at 9 points in the Philippines, and the campaign to seize control of this important strategic area was well underway. After a thorough softening up process, the invaders pressed onward toward Manila, and what they hoped would be a quick victory on Luzon. During the first weeks of fighting on Luzon, the Japanese steadily reinforced their original assault units. As 1941 neared its end, the Japanese were succeeding in closing in on Manila from 2 directions. The Japanese plan for choking off the Philippine capital was working perfectly. Nipponese planes began bombing Manila in early December. The air attacks continued as the invading ground forces drew closer to the Philippine capital. The Japanese raids on U.S. airfields took a heavy toll of U.S. planes, many destroyed on the ground. At year's end, advanced Japanese units approached within sight of Manila, which was still bombed, though it had been declared an open city. In little more than 3 weeks, the spearhead of the Japanese ground offensive on the capital had driven within striking distance of the objective. Evacuated by its defenders, Manila was the invaders for the taking. The Philippine capital passed into the hands of the enemy on January 2nd, 1942. The Nipponese claimed they were liberating the island, but most Filipinos scarcely considered it liberation. Japanese propaganda units went into action at once, spreading the doctrine of Asia for the Asiatics. Are we not all of the Far East, they asked? The advantages of life in the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere were dinned into the consciousness of Filipinos of all ages.
Mga kababayan, ang mga Hapon ay hindi nating kalaban.
Some Filipinos helped the Japanese in their campaign. In Manila's streets, Filipino collaborationists spoke to their countrymen in Tagalog, a Philippine native tongue. The conquerors blamed the Philippines' troubles on the U.S. But their campaign was not an overwhelming success. Most Filipinos remained unconvinced. They remembered the story of Japanese rule in China and Manchuria. The greater East Asia propaganda continued throughout the occupation, but it needed strong backing. In mid-March, with the enemy in control of almost all of Luzon, General Douglas MacArthur, the American commander, left the island on orders from Washington and assumed new duties in Australia. The general arrived on the down-under continent to take over the preparations for mounting an offensive against the enemy at the earliest opportunity. In Manila, the start of the Japanese occupation was celebrated by the invaders with a parade through the center of the city. The seizure of the Philippine capital gave the Nipponese more satisfaction than most of their other conquests. Most gratified of all was the Japanese commander, General Masaharu Homma, to whom this day was one of the most memorable of his military career. General Homma would have found it hard to believe that this city, whose people regularly paid him deference on Japanese proclaimed holidays, would 4 years later be the setting for his execution for war crimes. But during early 1942, it was hard for the Filipinos to see beyond the Japanese occupation, to visualize their country again free from the yoke of the conqueror. Under Japanese rule, some Filipinos openly collaborated with the invaders. In late April 1942, Corregidor in Manila Bay was the last outpost to resist the Japanese invaders of Luzon. For almost a month, the Japanese bombarded the island fortress with every weapon at their command.
Sir,
Finally, on May 5th, 1942, Japanese assault units crossed the narrow channel separating Luzon from Corregidor and stormed the rock's sturdy defenses. After nearly 24 hours, fighting on the island ceased on May 6th. That afternoon, General Jonathan Wainwright, the American commander, met with General Hama on nearby Bataan Peninsula to effect the surrender. At first, the American commander surrendered only those forces on Corregidor and neighboring islets in Manila Bay, but not the American units still fighting the Japanese elsewhere in the Philippines. Later, however, General Wainwright was forced to surrender all his Philippine units, and in a tremulous voice he announced his action to them over the Japanese-controlled radio. The historic statement was recorded by the gloating conquerors.
It is Lieutenant General J.M. Wainwright. To put a stop to further useless sacrifice of human life on the fortified islands, yesterday I tendered to Lieutenant General Conway, the Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Forces in the Philippines, the formal surrender of all American and Philippine Army troops in the Philippine Islands. This decision, on my part, you will realize, was forced upon me by men entirely beyond my control.
General Hama, the Beast of Bataan, soon set out to visit the scene of the epic battle for the island fortress. After a difficult campaign which had lasted 5 months, the invaders had finally succeeded in overpowering the remnants of the American Luzon force. The final battle had been one of the most bitterly fought defenses in history. The victorious Japanese inspected the area with interest. The valiant stand made by the U.S. 4th Marine Regiment, with a mixture of soldiers, sailors, and Filipinos attached, will never be forgotten by the Japanese who participated in the battle for Corregidor. The victors were especially curious about the weapons which had caused them so much trouble before the assault troops overran the island's defenses. After the capture of Corregidor, the Japanese quickly gained control of all the Philippines. In the United States, a month later, the Philippine Commonwealth government was represented by its president in exile, Manuel Quezon. The first steps toward Philippine independence, so hopefully planned 7 years earlier in Washington, had received a staggering setback. But with the support of the United States,